Welcome to the Red Sneaker Podcast, your guide to success in the worlds of writing and publishing. Now, here's your host, best-selling author and founder of the Red Sneaker Writers Center, William Bernhardt.
Hello, Red Sneaker Writers. This is episode 36, going out on January 13, 2020, the first podcast episode of the new decade. This podcast is for Red Sneaker writers, people who are serious about having a writing career and want some practical knowledge to help them do it. The big news this time around is that there's a new Red Sneaker Writers book on the horizon. It's called What Writers Need to Know. This is the 9th book in the series and a little different from my previous books in this series. This one is an anthology, a collection of shorter pieces on topics that writers need to know about, important, but not so detailed that they demanded an entire book devoted to them. So this one's a compilation of essential topics, and that's available now. On this podcast episode, we're going to be talking to Jennifer Lynn Barnes. She's been on the podcast before talking about the id list and how you can use it to improve your writing. This time, I'm going to ask her about her specialty field, young adult fiction, where she's done more than 19 books for major publishers. We're also going to have some writing tips, but first, the news. If you haven't had an opportunity to visit the website called Writer Beware, this would be a good time to do it. They've just issued alerts on 2 different potential writer scams out there, one involving a writing contest and another involving an invitation to join a collaborative anthology or box set. But they're doing this sort of thing all the time. Sadly, even in this day and age, there are a lot of people out there trying to scam writers or take advantage of people's desire to be published in a way that is not helpful to them. So check out Writer Beware sometime soon. I think you'll be glad you did. While you're running around the internet and web surfing, you might want to visit a new blog by an author named Benedict Evans. That's Evans, and you can find it at his website, which, as you might have guessed, is ben-evans.com. This one takes a long, deep look at Amazon, which, as writers, we have to be involved with, like it or not, and just exactly what is their market share. You've heard me say, probably many times, that Amazon sells more than 50% of all books sold in the United States. True. That Amazon is now the number 1 retailer in the United States. True. Bigger than Walmart. But what exactly does that mean? Sure, that's the big gross picture, but Evans breaks it down in an interesting way. He's a consultant and an analyst and has insight into some of these tech and media issues that I at least would not. He says, overall, yes, and now we're not just talking about books, we're talking about e-commerce. That would include people who aren't obsessed with books like we are. But he says that overall, Amazon accounts for about 35% of all U.S. e-commerce, not just books, but big picture, 35% of everything sold in the United States over the web is attributable to Amazon. But what is that when you look at all commerce, both brick and mortar sales and e-commerce and whatever else might be out there? He says Amazon accounts for about 6% of all U.S. commerce. And if you just look at the brick and mortar part, Walmart still outsells Amazon. It's an interesting take on this. And, when you look at physical retailers, then Walmart, or for that matter, Barnes & Noble, don't look quite as insignificant. And that can be important when you're making decisions like who you're going to have distribute your book. Are you going to go exclusive or are you going to go wide? So if that interests you, you might take a look at that. And while you're running around the web even longer, here's another thing you might want to look at, and this one's on YouTube, and this is a presentation by Will Dages, that's Dages. He's at Findaway Voices, And he presented a conference session called How Indie Authors Can Sell More Audiobooks. And that's now available on YouTube. If you're interested in audiobook sales, and if you're not, you should be, because that's a major source of book world activity right now. But anyway, he indicates that although Audible, which is owned by Amazon, is still the number one player, they may not be quite as big as some people realize. They're at somewhere between 41%, not quite half of all audiobook sales for most authors. But that doesn't mean you should be exclusive to them. And Dages gives you an actual case study where he shows somebody increased their total sales from audiobook by 21% by going wide rather than Amazon exclusive. I think a lot of people think that Audible is just about the only game in town, like 90% or more, and that's just not true. And Dages does a good job of illustrating that. Now, to be fair, he's with Findaway Voices, which is a distributor for audiobooks, so obviously it would not be in their interests to promote Amazon exclusivity. Nonetheless, the numbers are there, and it's a good presentation. And if you're interested in audiobooks, and you should be, might check this out. And here's one last recommendation for your web surfing. You may have, like I have, heard all these rumors throughout time about how people buy their way onto the New York Times list by buying books from targeted bookstores that they know report to the list and getting themselves on the New York Times list that way. Is that just a rumor? Does that actually happen? Well, if this subject interests you, go to the website called Book Riot and look for a blog post by an author named Sarah Nicholas. That's Nicols, because she pretty much not only says it's true, but gives you some very specific examples involving people like, say, our president, Donald Trump, back in 1987 with The Art of the Deal, or now his son, Donald Trump Jr., and his new book, Triggered, both of which hit the list after having people, either themselves or people working at their directives, buy huge quantities from targeted bookstores. It seems this not only happens, but the New York Times is very well aware of it. There's not much they can do. I mean, it's a bestseller list, and if the books sell, then they go on the list. But the clue, it turns out, that the Times gives people when bulk purchases like this appears to have distorted the numbers, the clue they give is on the listing, like and the actual list itself. After an entry that has benefited from this kind of huge targeted book buying, they'll put a dagger in parentheses, perhaps like me. You've seen that dagger before, but didn't know what it meant. Well, now you do. One last item I can report. I predicted this, but now that 2019 has drawn to a close, I can tell you with absolute truth and certainty that the best-selling book of 2019 was Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. She edged out last year's winner, Becoming by Michelle Obama, which is still selling strong. It's number 2, but the number 1 book for 2019 with more than 4.5 copies sold is this book, this novel, this first novel from a 70-year-old retired wildlife biologist, Delia Owens. Putnam's first printing of this book was 28,000 copies. As it turned out, that was not quite enough. I hope you find this as inspirational as I do. When I do WriterCon, when I do my conferences, when I do the cruise that we're preparing to do in a couple of weeks now, I see all kinds of people who are writing their first novel, but don't know whether or not they're just kidding themselves or they have talent. Should they stick with it or not? Or maybe they are themselves retired or at a later stage in their lives and they wonder, have I waited too long? Well, the answer is no, not kidding yourself. Haven't waited too long. Just sit down and write like Delia Owens did with this very atmospheric, moody tale about a young, lonely girl who basically comes of age in the marshes of North Carolina. If you were asking me to explain why this book took off, I don't think I could. I don't think anybody really can. After the fact, you can go back and try and explain it all. It's about, maybe it's about environmental concerns, but, at the end of the day, I think it's a well-written book telling an absorbing story. And what have I said in those red sneaker books over and over again? Learn, write, revise, but at the end, and market, but at the end of the day, it all comes down to how good is the book? How well is it written? That's why this Red Sneaker Center exists, so that you can write the best book you possibly can, and then maybe sometime in the future we'll be talking about your novel being the top bookseller for the year. Let me give you the brief background, just in case you don't know. This dispute came about because of a writer named Courtney Milan, Milan, and the way she was treated by Romance Writers of America, an organization, big organization that a lot of romance writers are members of. They give the RWA awards at a big conference every year. And Milan, the author in question, was not only a former board member of RWA, but chairman of its ethics committee. Anyway, the dispute involves a novel called Somewhere Lies the Moon, written by Catherine Lynn Davis, which on Twitter, Milan called, quote, a racist mess, end quote. She took issue with a lot of what she saw in this book. I should inform you that Ms. Milan is herself Chinese American, and this book involved 19th century Chinese women, including, she singled out a description of, quote, slanted almond eyes, end quote, and a quote from the character in which the women are described as, quote, demure and quiet, as our mothers have trained us to be, end quote. Well, Milan felt that this was completely playing into stereotypic, even racist portrayals of Chinese women as submissive, and, it's a racist stereotype, and she said so on Twitter. Well, the author felt differently. She's an honorary RWA member, and she disagreed. She said, look, the book is historically accurate. It's based on years of research. I don't like the way things were any more than you do, but this is accurate. She filed an ethics complaint with RWA. She called Milan's comments cyberbullying and said that they had had a dramatic impact on her publishing career, even cost her a contract. And from there, it's just exploded. As various entities have written about this, many big-name authors have commented on it. The majority of the RWA board has now resigned, and they've canceled the awards program for this year, saying that maybe they'll give awards for this year or next year, but they're going to let things calm down, which all things considered is probably smart. Well, what's the writing tip? I bet you've already guessed it. Well, maybe not. If you're thinking the tip is don't write about anybody of a different race from your own, or even don't mention people's race in your book, that's not going to work. We live in a very diverse world, and absolutely, if your characters were all of a single race, creed, color, you might well be criticized for that. I think we have to deal with the complexity and diversity of the world we live in, but you have to do it in a way that is sensitive. Even, I would say, cautious, because without naming any names, I think it's fair to say that some reactions on these issues have been overreactions, and it doesn't take much to get a Twitter storm going, but you can see how damaging that can be to your career, so you need to be cautious. In the newsletter, the Red Sneaker newsletter, I've talked about sensitivity reads, which is the idea of sending your manuscript out before publishing it to someone to comment on these very kinds of issues. Are you being sensitive to racial or religious or ethnic issues? Even if you don't call it that, even if you just want to send it to beta readers, pick beta readers who are of the race or religion or knowledgeable about it and can comment intelligently. As we can see from this case, the fact that your portrayal may